A lot has been riding on this episode. Between controversies, alleged rewrites, the degradation of the fandom, the Amazing Digital Circus's success completely overshadowing the show, and a painful 7-month wait time, the 7th episode of Murder Drones needed to succeed. This was the make and break episode that couldn't get away with just being average or even good. It had to surpass expectations to justify all that the fanbase has gone through over the past 7 months. And if you had asked me if this episode would succeed at this Herculean task, I would have told you not to get your hopes up. But I was wrong. Murder Drones Episode 7, Mass Destruction, is astonishingly good. I'm going to go over a summary of what happens in this episode, so if you want to get right to the review, skip to the time displayed on screen. The episode begins with a flashback of a laboratory inside of an underground church running tests on Uzi's mother, Nori. An intern by the name of Mitchell accidentally puts on the wrong name tag, getting himself way over his head as he's mistaken for another scientist, and being told by the head scientist to go fetch Yeva. Mitchell tries to the best of his ability to find Yeva and eventually succeeds in bringing her back to the church, but by the time he gets back, something seems wrong. Mitchell cautiously enters the church, leaving Yeva outside, and everything seems business as usual, but there is something about the atmosphere that is off. As he slowly walks down the hallway, he sees a USB in the shape of a cross carrying the patch to the Absolute Solver, lying in a puddle of blood. As he reaches for the cross, he sees the lead scientist hiding in fear as her arm has been ripped off. A tendril then grabs her and drags her into a flesh pit inside of the church, breaking the illusion, revealing that everyone has been killed. Nori rises out of the flesh pit, now completely possessed by sin, and launches the cross at the intern, but before we see him die, the tape showing the sequence of events is paused by Nori's core, which is still alive. We then cut back to the main cast, which is just climbing out of the rubble of the elevator crash, and immediately falls into a fit of rage trying to dig his way back up to save V, nearly throwing a boulder onto Uzi in the process. En goes to apologize while Tessa is more on edge than ever as she is seeing Uzi lose more and more control of her solver abilities. Uzi once again loses control, creating an explosion that separates the group from each other. Meanwhile, on the surface, Lizzie and Thad are walking to the corpse pyre because Lizzie's secret friend told her to, and they see Jay go inside and destroy the landing pod the disassembly drones arrived in and then flying away. Khan arrives as well with a blueprint for Uzi's railgun as he begins rebuilding it using parts from the Spire just like Uzi did in episode 1. Back underground, En sees a hologram of V, which reveals itself to be Sin, who hugs him, giving him a flashback to when he used to be controlled by Sin and aided her in killing humanity. Sin then drags En through some tunnels, but Nori uses her solver powers to cut him free with a pickaxe, and they are able to lose Sin. Nori explains who she is, and En is ecstatic to tell Uzi that she's alive, but Nori makes him promise not to, as she believes it's for the best that Uzi never meets the person who indirectly started all of this and ruined her life. Meanwhile, Tessa is looking throughout the tunnels and stumbles on a computer that contains patch information for the Absolute Solver, and destroys it. She is then quickly ambushed by Doll, interrogating her for the patch, but Tessa feigns innocence and counters Doll's attacks with little difficulty. The tunnels then turn pitch black as Tessa disappears. Doll is left afraid and confused, not being able to detect where Tessa is going to attack from, and doesn't even get a chance to defend herself as something leaps out at her from the dark. While all of this is happening, Uzi finds her way to the church and looks through Nori's research, continuing the tape that was playing the flashback at the beginning of the episode. The cross that a sin-possessed Nori launched at Mitchell is intercepted by Yeva, who launches it back at her, stabbing her in the face and curing Nori of the Absolute Solver. But right before Sin is fully locked out from Nori, she uses Nori's right hand to prepare a massive explosion. Yeva cuts Nori's arm off, causing it to fall into the flesh pit within the church, causing the center of Copper 9 to implode, which led to the collapse that killed the humans. Uzi is horrified by what she saw on the tape as she backs away, but she doesn't get much time to process what she saw as Doll, with her torso ripped open, stumbles into the church and collapses on the ground dead with a message on her visor telling her to fight back. Tessa walks in on this scene and pieces 2 and 2 together, believing that it was Uzi that killed Doll, and prepares to kill Uzi, who can't defend herself as for some reason, her Absolute Solver doesn't affect Tessa. Right before Tessa kills Uzi, En intervenes, giving Tessa one chance to answer his question if she knew about the patch. Instead of answering his question, Tessa is about to make a clever comment, but is cut off as En decapitates her. En tries to give Uzi the cross with the patch on it that was given to him by Nori, but it's too late as Sin has already completely possessed her and she destroys the cross. Just as Uzi is about to kill En, Nori saves him, and together they fight against Uzi and put up a good fight, but can't kill her as En doesn't want any harm to befall Uzi. Due to this, En and Nori lose the fight, but as a last-ditch effort, En admits to Nori that Uzi and him may be romantically interested in each other, which angers Nori enough to land a critical blow on Uzi, coupled with Uzi's own internal shock at the confession, snapping her out of Sin's control. Unfortunately for Nori, Uzi is so mad and flustered about the situation that she punts Nori into the flesh pit, in which En in a panic tells her that that was her mom, and they both scream in panic before hugging each other. While the two are hugging, they don't notice that Tessa's body has come back to life, and reattached her head before peeling off her suit and eating Doll's solver core. Uzi and En both turn around to see that who they thought was Tessa was actually Sin the whole time, wearing Tessa's rotting corpse as a stitched-together skin suit. The Sin-Tessa hybrid attacks En, knocking him unconscious, and crawls into the flesh pit, dragging En and Uzi with her, using her tendrils. Back on the surface, Jay returns to above the labs with Tessa's ship, but before she can signal that they are ready to leave, she gets hit by a bus being driven by Khan, causing her to drop the keys into a hole that leads to the flesh pit underground. As Jay recuperates, she sees Lizzie armed with Uzi's rebuilt railgun, accompanied by Thad preparing to fight her. Before Uzi and En are dragged to the bottom of the pit, Uzi sees the keys falling and throws En over the edge, and catches the keys and launches them into En's shoulder before Solver pushing him out of the church. The episode ends with Uzi sacrificing herself and being dragged to the bottom of the pit, where she awakens floating in outer space. The characters in Murder Drones have always been a highlight, and even though they weren't at their best in episode 6, surely they will be better in this episode, right? Uzi in this episode is acceptable, but doesn't really do much of any interest throughout the majority of Mass Destruction. She's mostly just reacting to things, be it En accidentally revealing Tessa's plans, Nori's origins, or Doll's death, all of which don't affect her in any long-form way, or reveal more about her as a character. En's blunder only temporarily scares her and is never mentioned again. We never hear Uzi's thoughts on Nori, as it is more than likely going to be expanded upon in episode 8, and her reaction to Doll is primarily confusion, which is reasonable, but not particularly interesting. The only moment Uzi stood out was her reaction to En's confession, which was as adorable as it was funny, and might be my favorite Newsy moment in the series. Usually when Uzi is shoved to the sidelines though, that means that En picks up the slack just like he did in episode 5, but believe it or not, that isn't the case in this episode. He definitely gets more of a focus than Uzi, but not to the point where I can say confidently that he is the central character of the entire episode. Still, he is responsible for one of the most shocking moments in the episode, when he kills Tessa, which while at first I felt conflicted about because it seemed so out of character for him, and to be candid, it still sorta does. But could you imagine how much worse it would have been if he couldn't bring himself to kill Tessa when she's actively hurting Uzi? I'll probably make a separate video discussing this moment, but overall, I liked it and it added an air of seriousness to En that he has sorely been lacking throughout the whole series. Speaking of Tessa, she is underwhelming. Her best moment was the twist at the end of the episode, which I will get to later, but her character outside of that moment wasn't anything special, which is pretty disappointing as Tessa's been the standout character for the last 2 episodes of the show. What has made Tessa such a good character in prior episodes is her easygoing goofball personality that was perfectly balanced by her unwavering fortitude and at times empathetic moments. She still carries on that drive in this episode, but outside of a single offhand comment she says to Uzi at the beginning of the episode, the charm that she used to have is completely absent. This may seem appropriate given how dire the circumstances are, but even back in episode 6 when the group was cornered by the Sentinels, she still was able to throw out some characteristically odd but funny jokes, and yet we see none of that here. Thankfully, we have a brand new character to pick up the slack, is what I would have said if I liked Nori, but I don't. I actually kind of hate her. Nori is exactly what you would expect her to be personality-wise. She's edgy and aggressive just like Uzi, but she is much more mature and wiser, which while that makes sense due to her having more experience, she's just a more boring version of Uzi, whose only purpose is to deliver exposition. I'm sure we will get some amazing interactions between her and Uzi in episode 8, but in this episode, I don't think she did or said a single thing that was memorable or unexpected, making her feel like a waste of precious screen time. You know, screen time that could have been given to another character. A character who was in this episode for less than 30 seconds. Liam, why do you hate me? Glitch, you're cool, you made her into a plushie, but seriously, Jay has to do something monumental in episode 8 to justify her revival now. It is cool that she's being set up to fight Lizzie and Thad, who even with so little screen time in this episode, I'm quite glad to see return, but it's the third character that is tagging along with them that I have a problem with. Khan in this episode feels oddly confident for a character who left his own daughter to die in episode 1. I understand that he's been undergoing a subtle character arc of him caring more about Uzi, but him taking charge and leading an assault against Jay feels so impossibly out of character for him that it only reinforces the feeling that episode 1 is only pseudo-canon at this point. As he mentions, he knows that the planet is going to die soon because of the drawings in Nori's closet, but if he knew that this was going to happen eventually, and he's a master engineer, what exactly was his plan for the planet dying if he was just going to keep the colony in the bunker indefinitely? If he had a single line like, "I have been preparing for this day," or "I have been working on a plan to get the colony off the planet for years," or something like that, that would have made Khan willingly leaving the bunker and leading an attack against Jay at least slightly more believable, but he doesn't say anything like that, and while his personality is still consistent with the Khan we know, his actions are not. Finally, let's talk about my biggest problem with the entire episode: Doll. Although Doll hasn't gotten the spotlight in quite some time, I loved her as a character, and for those wondering why, I explain in detail why that is in my episode 3 review. So I was excited to see what role she was going to play throughout the story and how her arc of trying to avenge her parents would conclude. But to my disbelief, she is unceremoniously killed off. I don't have a problem with the fact that Doll died in this episode. In fact, she was the character I bet would most likely to die. My problem with this choice is that, like V, she feels like an incomplete character. The initial reason she's brought into the story is to kill V for some very understandable reasons, only for her role to switch to trying to find a cure, which Tessa already knew about and she was making a deal with to help find it. Yet, for reasons that are never explained, she betrays Tessa to get to the cure first. But even though she had a head start and got to the mines first, Tessa was still able to get to the cure right before she did, raising the question, what was even the point of her betraying Tessa? Doll gained no advantage from getting a head start on the cast, she didn't learn anything that Tessa didn't already know, and from a writing perspective, she isn't even a good driving force to inspire the cast to head down into the labs, because even if she didn't betray Tessa, the group would have gone into the labs anyway. Everything Doll did in episodes 6 and 7 had no payoff whatsoever and didn't contribute to the story or the character. Doll doesn't even get closure to her parents' deaths, as she doesn't get a chance to see that it was Yeva who stopped the planet from being completely destroyed, which would have been a great moment to see, as even though there is no way to bring her parents back, she could have at least learned that Yeva was a hero, which would have further strengthened her resolve, and it could have reignited her hatred for V, interrogating Uzi for where she is, only for her to learn that she indirectly caused V's death, finally giving her closure. But instead, she doesn't learn anything about Yeva, she doesn't learn about V, everything she has done in this series has no lasting effects on anything, and her story ends with her being one of the most pointless and inconsequential characters in the show, which is way less than she deserves because of how well her motivations and intentions were written. Doll deserved so much more, and just like V and J, she is going to be one of those characters critics of this show point to as examples of how messily written this series can be, with it being clear that there was never a plan written ahead of time for these characters' purposes and should have never been introduced in the first place. Mass Destruction is easily the least character-driven episode in the series. There are very few standout moments or lines from the cast. Uzi and N are mostly just reacting to things so that the audience can understand what's happening, but the actual characters themselves are unaffected by these revelations. Tessa and Khan fail to live up to their reputations, Nori is a discount Uzi, and Doll is a wasted character. You can tell how weak the characters in this episode are written when Lizzie and Thad are the most intriguing characters in this episode, and they only got 2 to 3 scenes. Under most circumstances, a product would have a very hard time recovering from this. Why should you care about what the characters are going through if the characters are uninteresting and don't earn your attention? And this is where the sheer genius of this episode comes in. I may not like the cast in this episode, but nearly everything else about this episode is phenomenal. Some initial fans of the series have felt bait and switched, as this show was pitched as a light horror series, and ever since episode 2, the horror hasn't really met the expectations the show set. Well, this episode is probably the most violent, gruesome, and horror-based installment in the series. Moments such as when Mitchell is slowly walking through the church only to turn to see the lead scientist hiding in fear, obscured by darkness as her torn off arm is lying right beside her, and to convey the scientist's shock at seeing this is just a few moments of complete silence as he and the viewer register what they are seeing, wasn't scary per se, but there are very few moments in this series that were directed in such a way that was so unconventional, effective, and embodied a specific feeling, in this case being shock, so well. This scene was held back by not wanting to age restrict the episode, as most of the blood and gore being shrouded in darkness made it hard to realize exactly what you were looking at, and even I didn't catch that the scientist's arm was separated from her body till my second viewing of the episode, but I perfectly understand what they were going for with this moment, and even if it didn't hit as hard as it should have, I still love it for how well it stood out, and the intentional scene and sound directional style they used to deliver it. And while I hate Doll's death, how she dies is easily the scariest moment in the entire show. It's a nightmare come true. She's all alone with nothing but the light of her solver as she hears the horrifying, indescribable sounds of the creature approaching her. And right when the audience is baited into thinking when the creature is about to strike by using the creature's point of view, closing in on her, it doesn't, sustaining the tension of the moment until it happens again, as Doll is only able to see the unrecognizable mass of the creature as we look through her point of view, and as Doll makes one last desperate attempt to defend herself, we get a glimpse of the creature FNAFing the camera. This moment was terrifying, and for any horror fan was probably one of the best moments in the entire series. There's also the scene where Sin reveals to N that alongside V and J assisted her with killing humanity, which was surprisingly violent as we see N holding a corpse of a person as his head falls off, N and J eating a person, and some other disassembly drones ripping a person in half. The only reason the scene was even allowed is because of the artistic choice to make all of the human silhouettes, which while it did dumb down the brutality of it, we still get to see enough blood spray to make it effectively violent. This scene from a visual standpoint was amazing, and only further accentuated how much more horror-based this episode is, but from a writing standpoint, while it was cool, it didn't really add much to the story for it to imply anything meaningful, making it forgettable beyond the visuals. And finally, the scene that caught everyone off guard, even if it was predicted by Cartoon Universe right after episode 6 came out, the twist that Tessa was Sin is probably going to be in my top 5 moments in the entire series. Everything about it was perfect. The bloody shedding of the suit, the gruesome devouring of Doll's corpse and core, the momentary ooh face, the twisting and cracking of the body, the subtle fluctuation between Sin and Tessa's voice as she references a line she said all the way back in episode 2, the design of her being reminiscent of Liam Vickers' signature artistic style perfectly being translated into 3D, her reveal being augmented by the score that incorporated demented screaming into the soundtrack. This scene was breathtaking, and I don't think I could have made it better if I tried. What makes it even better is the realization of what exactly Tessa is. It's Sin. wearing the skin of Tessa, meaning that Tessa died during the Gala massacre. Sin up to this point was an alright character, but not that great of a villain. She never really did anything that made me as a viewer hate her or disagree with what she was doing. After all, the people she killed weren't exactly the kindest, so if anything I was rooting for her instead of hating her. But this changed that. She killed Tessa, the quirky and charismatic teenage girl that we got to know throughout episode 5, who treated N.V. and J with the kindness that nobody else did. The girl who, instead of running away from an entity far more powerful than her, instead went against the odds and tried to be the hero, and she paid for it. Now, the only thing that lasts of Tessa is her personality and corpse being used as a tool by the very thing she died trying to defeat. It's morbid, twisted, and beyond evil, and now I am more invested than ever to see our cast defeat Sin. Not only that, but this reveal was expertly built up to. Among the rumors of rewrites, many fans think that this twist wasn't a part of the original script, but this reveal was hinted at all the way back in episode 4, when we see Tessa's body and then see her hand creep around the corner. It's hinted at in episode 5 when Sin puts one of the robot bugs inside of a doll, foreshadowing what she would later do to Tessa, and finally in episode 6, we see she fails to bypass the Sentinel security, which only a human could do, and if you look very closely, you can actually see the metal of Sin's wrist where the bite mark is from when she got bitten by the Sentinel. These 3 scenes, alongside the impractical, dark, and creatively edgy setting of an abandoned church underground, were all crafted so well that it set the bar for what Murder Drones is capable of and delivered a new level of horror not yet seen before, finally delivering on its identity as a horror series. But that isn't to say that this episode doesn't have some problems other than the characters and Doll's death. The Tessa reveal, while brilliant, was hinted at far too much within this episode. Nori hints at it, Doll's death scene makes it obvious, and in case you hadn't figured it out by that point, we also see Uzi try to use her Absolute Solver on her and it not affecting her, just like how Doll's powers didn't affect Uzi in episode 3. I think if Tessa and Doll had never interacted, and we just got to see Doll witnessing the aftermath of the explosion caused by Tessa, and then we get Doll's death, that would have made it a lot less obvious. But the moment Doll turned away and Tessa was missing and we see a yellow Absolute Solver ability being used to snuff out the flames, I knew that Tessa was connected to the Absolute Solver in some way, which hurt the shock value of N decapitating Tessa because I knew she was going to come back to life. I also found that while the darkness of this episode did aid in making it so horror-oriented, there were moments that were ever slightly too dark. This is more of a nitpick than an actual critique, and it might have just been me, but it was something I noticed enough to give a passing mention. Another thing that bothered me quite a bit was how V's death was handled in this episode. I did like that N cared enough to try to dig back to V, but the moment he realizes Uzi was almost hurt, he immediately forgets about V and she's never brought up again. It's just another example to add to the pile of others where N's near obsessive care for Uzi has overshadowed every other relationship he has with any character in this show, making him one-track minded and predictable. And if that wasn't enough to undermine V's death, Lizzie mentions communicating with a secret friend about stopping Jay, and who else could that be other than V? Basically confirming that she's still alive, which kills any shock value there is to her return in episode 8. And if I'm wrong about this in the future, then this complaint will become more of a compliment, because that would be an amazing subversion of expectations. There's also the ending cliffhanger that actually detracted from the ending of the episode. I would have rather the Uzi floating in space scene be cut altogether, as it didn't reveal anything that shocking, and only added confusion along with killing the tension of her surviving being pulled into the flesh pit. And lastly, I'm usually able to comprehend the plot of this show with little difficulty, but with this episode, it really did take multiple rewatches to understand the implications of what some of the big reveals meant. This has been a common and very reasonable critique of the show, with some people who don't enjoy murder drones citing that they don't like having to analyze each and every scene to understand the plot, and this episode, which was supposed to answer many of those questions, couldn't be a better example of this critique, as it at times did feel like it was trying to speedrun concluding some of the loose ends the show has, and even after the credits rolled, I still had so many questions alongside so much to process that mass destruction didn't really feel like it was the episode that was supposed to reveal so much like it had been advertised. So yeah, this episode isn't perfect, and it has far more horror than any episode in the series. But if you don't like horror, there are still two aspects of this episode that are done very well. Firstly, the fight scene. It hasn't been since episode 3 that we have gotten a proper fight scene in Murder Drones, and this one didn't disappoint. The dynamic of this fight being a tag team of En and Nori fighting Uzi, but En has to hold back from killing her, was as creative as it was engaging, and had some excellently choreographed moments, accompanied by some of the best music we have heard in the series since episode 3. This fight is a little bittersweet for me, however. As I mentioned earlier, I hate Nori, and Doll had earned a swan song scene before she had died, and what moment would have been more perfect than this? Imagine if it was just Doll fighting against Uzi, who is severely outclassed as she is struggling to control her solver powers in the state she's in, while Sin controlling Uzi has complete mastery over the absolute solver. Imagine if Doll is so outclassed that she purposely overheats herself in a last-ditch effort, transforming her into her solver form and going feral just like Uzi did in episode 4. Something that Doll fans had been theorizing and looking forward to for months. Still, I can appreciate this fight for what it is, and while it may not have been better than episode 3's fight against Doll, it did do something that I didn't believe was possible this late into the series. It made Newsy matter. There's been a common misconception about me that I hate Newsy, and like I stated way back in my concern about Murder Drones video, I don't. I just find it to be completely unnecessary and a waste of valuable screen time, as everything that happened in this series up to this point would have been no different if En and Uzi were just best friends. Well, this changed that. En's confession being used as a method to give Uzi control of her body may be a trope, but it utilized Newsy to serve a purpose to the plot. And it wasn't done in the stereotypical way like En kissing her or telling her that he loves her. It's actually done in a cleverly ambiguous and in-character way that didn't make it overly dramatic or feel like it was straight out of a fanfiction. En even took the time to draw a dog. And like I mentioned earlier, the aftermath of this confession of Uzi screaming at him for confessing only for En to accidentally break his promise to Nori by telling her that Nori was alive, resulting in him screaming, and crescendoing in them both now screaming, was funny, adorable, and perfectly timed so that the moment didn't feel awkward. Mass Destruction is a love letter to every fan of this series, no matter who you are, be it a Newsy fan, a horror fan, a Liam Vickers fan, an action fan, or just a Murder Drones fan. This episode took on such a massive task of proving the naysayers wrong, and believe me, this series has a lot of issues, and some of them aren't absent in this episode. Like I pointed out with the less than stellar characterization of the cast, and sure, the comedy may not be as effective in this episode in comparison to others, but I think that's when the comedy is at its best in this series, when it's an augmenting element instead of a central focus. But despite all of that, this episode's highs far surpassed its lows, and for me, it did something that only the best of follow-ups can do. It made the previous episodes better. It made Cabin Fever and Home, my two least favorite episodes, more enjoyable in retrospect because the events that happened in those episodes had a payoff in this episode, those being Newsy and the Tessa twist, which were both strong elements in this episode that couldn't have done what they had did if it wasn't for episodes 4 and 5. This episode might not have surpassed episode 3, but it came close. And more importantly, it reminded me why I fell in love with what I still consider to be the best web series on the internet.
Oh yes, get snuck upon.
But if you close your eyes, does it over